You fired the one person who just saved your father's life." The words had not been spoken yet, but the truth was already hanging in the air, silent and waiting to destroy everything Ethan Caldwell believed about control, power, and judgment. The security camera footage flickered on the wide office screen, casting a cold blue glow across the polished marble floor. Ethan stood tall behind his desk, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence like glass. The young maid in front of him, Lily Harper, held a small ring of keys in her trembling hand. One of them slipped slightly between her fingers, catching the light for a brief second before disappearing back in her grip. There was no room for doubt in a life like his. What he did not see, what he did not care to see, was the way her hand had been shaking not from fear of losing her job, but from something deeper, something urgent, something desperate. And somewhere across the city, in a dim apartment filled with the faint smell of medicine and silence, that same set of keys had already opened a door that would change his life forever. The door closed behind Lily Harper with a soft click that sounded far too quiet for the weight it carried. And for a few seconds she just stood there in the empty service hallway, her hand still hovering in the air where the handle had been, as if letting go of that door meant letting go of something much bigger than a job. Her breath uneven, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. But the tremor would not stop, not in her fingers, not in her heart. And slowly she looked. She reached her destination, a narrow building with peeling paint and a flickering light above the entrance. And she hurried up the stairs, her steps quick but careful, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile balance she was holding together. And when she pushed the door open, the smell of medicine and stale air wrapped around her immediately, familiar and suffocating. And on the bed near the window lay a man, pale and still, his breathing shallow, machines beside him, humming softly with each passing second. And Lily rushed to his side, dropping her bag to the floor as she reached for his hand, her voice trembling now, no longer able to hide the fear she had been holding back. "I am here. It is okay. I am here," she whispered, brushing his hair gently away from his forehead, her eyes scanning the small monitor, reading numbers she had learned to understand out of necessity, not training. And then her gaze shifted to the stack of unpaid medical bills on the table, the bold red letters screaming urgency, past due, final notice, each one a reminder that time was running out. And she swallowed hard, reaching in her pocket where the small silver key rested against her fingers, her grip tightening around it as memories flashed through her mind. The quiet hallway, the locked office, the safe she had opened with shaking hands, the envelope she had taken, not for herself, never for herself, but for this moment, for this man lying in front of her. And tears filled her eyes, but did not fall, because she did not have the luxury of breaking down. Not now, not when everything depended on what she had done. And she leaned closer, her forehead resting lightly against his hand as she whispered, "You're going to be okay, I promise." Even though promises felt fragile in a world that had already taken so much, and outside, far away in a glass tower of steel and power, Ethan Caldwell stood in his office unaware that the mistake he believed he had just corrected was in fact the beginning of something far more devastating, something that would soon reach him whether he was ready or not, because the truth had already been set in motion, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way back to him. The next morning arrived without warmth, without mercy, just a pale gray light slipping through the tall glass windows of Ethan Caldwell's office as the city below moved forward with its usual precision, and Ethan stood exactly where he had been the night before, his posture straight, his expression controlled, already immersed in numbers, contracts, and decisions that shaped entire industries, because for him, there was no pause, no reflection, only forward motion, and yet something small, almost insignificant, refused to settle in his mind. A faint irritation he could not quite name, like a detail out of place in an otherwise perfect system. And as Claire Bennett stepped into the office with her tablet in hand, her voice calm and efficient, "Good morning. Your 10 o'clock meeting has been moved to 11, and there is a report from finance that requires your approval." Ethan nodded without looking at her, his eyes scanning the screen in front of him. But then she hesitated just for a second, enough to shift the air in the room. And Ethan noticed, his gaze lifting slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his tone sharp, not out of anger, but expectation. And Claire glanced down at her tablet before speaking. "There's a discrepancy in one of the internal accounts, a withdrawal that was not authorized through the usual process." Ethan's attention sharpened instantly, the faint irritation in his chest tightening into something more focused. "How much?" he asked, and Claire answered carefully, "A significant amount, enough to trigger an internal review." The room seemed to grow quieter, the distant hum of the city fading behind the weight of that information. And Ethan turned fully now, his expression hardening. "Who had access?" he asked, already anticipating the answer before it came. And Claire met his gaze, her voice steady but cautious. "Very few people, sir, including senior staff and limited household personnel, with clearance to the office area." The word lingered, household personnel, and without needing to say her name, both of them knew exactly who that included. Lily Harper, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the pieces aligning too easily, too perfectly, reinforcing the conclusion he had already made the night before. "Of course," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She made a mistake and then tried to cover it." His voice carried no doubt, only cold certainty. And Claire watched him for a moment, something unreadable passing through her eyes, because while the logic was clean, something about it did not feel complete. "We are still reviewing the full activity trail," she added, choosing her words carefully. "There may be additional context." But Ethan had already turned away, dismissing the possibility with a small wave of his hand. "Find the money and document everything. I want a full report by the end of the day," he said, his tone final, the matter already categorized and resolved in his mind. Another problem identified, another weakness removed. But as Claire stepped out of the office, her grip tightening slightly around her tablet, she could not shake the image of Lily standing there the night before, silent, trembling, not defensive, not desperate in the way someone guilty would be, but something else entirely, something that did not match the narrative forming so quickly around her. And back across the city, Lily sat beside the bed, exhaustion etched into every movement as she carefully adjusted the blanket around the man resting there, her eyes heavy but determined. And on the small table beside her lay an envelope, now empty, its contents already exchanged for time, for treatment, for a fragile chance at survival. And she reached in her pocket again, her fingers wrapping around the small silver key as if it were a promise she could not afford to break. Because whatever happened next, whatever consequences waited for her, none of it mattered as long as the man in front of her kept breathing. And far away, in a world built on control and certainty, Ethan Caldwell signed his name at the bottom of another document, unaware that the truth he believed he had already solved was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, in ways he could not yet see. The rain began sometime in the late afternoon, a slow, steady drizzle that painted the city in muted gray and blurred the sharp edges of glass towers and crowded streets. And inside the Caldwell headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that few people could name, but everyone could feel, because whispers had already started moving through the offices, quiet conversations behind half-closed doors, fragments of speculation carried between departments. And at the center of it all was a single question no one dared ask out loud. Where did the money go? Doubt flickered across her face, not about what she had done, but about what would come next, because consequences had a way of finding people like her faster than they found anyone else. And back in the office tower, Claire stood abruptly, her decision made, gathering the files and stepping quickly toward Ethan's office, the door already open as if waiting for her. And Ethan glanced up, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. "I asked for a report by the end of the day," he said, his tone cold. But Claire did not stop, placing the tablet in front of him, her voice firm in a way it rarely was. "Then you need to see this now." Ethan's eyes flicked to the screen, scanning the paused frame of Lily holding that separate key, his expression tightening slightly, not with doubt yet, but with something closer to curiosity. And Claire continued, "She did not act like someone making a mistake. She acted like someone making a decision. The room fell quiet again, heavier this time, as if the truth was beginning to press against the surface, not fully revealed, but impossible to ignore. And for the first time since he had fired her, Ethan Caldwell felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not guilt, not yet, but the faint, unsettling possibility that he might have been wrong. The moment the image froze on the screen, something shifted in the room in a way that could not be undone, and Ethan Caldwell remained standing behind his desk, his eyes fixed on the still frame of Lily Harper holding that small separate key, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as the silence stretched between him and Claire Bennett. Because for the first time the version of events he had accepted so easily began to feel incomplete, not broken, not yet, but no longer solid, and he reached forward slowly, tapping the screen to replay the footage, watching again as Lily paused outside his office, her shoulders rising with a breath that looked almost like fear but not quite, something deeper, something heavier, and then the movement of her hand, deliberate, controlled, not the hesitation of someone unsure, but the resolve of someone who had already made a choice. And Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms as his mind began to work through the implications, each detail stacking against the certainty he had carried just hours before. Access logs, he said finally, his voice lower now, more focused and sharp, and Claire nodded immediately, pulling up the corresponding records. She entered the office after hours using authorized access. She explained, no signs of forced entry, no alerts triggered. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly because that detail mattered. That meant whatever happened had been done within the rules of the system, not outside of it. And he asked, and the safe, his tone. Careful now. Was it compromised? Claire shook her head. No visible damage, no forced override, which means the correct code was used. And that was the moment something cold settled deeper in Ethan's chest, because very few people had that level of access, and Lily Harper had never been one of them, at least not officially. And yet the evidence on the screen said otherwise, and before he could respond, the door opened again, this time without hesitation, and Victor Hale stepped inside, his presence carrying a different kind of energy, sharp, controlled, but edged with something closer to opportunism than concern. I heard there's an issue with internal funds, he said, his tone smooth but pointed, his eyes flicking briefly to the screen before settling on Ethan. If this is about the Maid, then I believe the situation is quite clear. Ethan did not immediately answer, his gaze still on the paused image. And Victor continued, stepping closer. She had access, she was present, and now the money is gone. There is no need to complicate something that is already obvious. His words landed cleanly, confidently, the kind of logic that fit perfectly into the structure Ethan had always trusted. And for a moment, it almost worked, almost restored the certainty that had begun to crack. But then Ethan spoke, quieter this time. Then why did she not run? Victor paused, just briefly, enough to register. And Ethan turned to face him fully, his eyes sharper now. If she stole that money, why walk back into my office? Why stand there? Why say nothing? Why leave without taking anything else? The questions hung in the air, not accusations, but not dismissible either, and Victor's expression tightened slightly before he replied. People make mistakes when they panic, but the answer felt thinner than it should have, and Claire watched the exchange carefully, her own certainty growing stronger with each passing second, because the pieces were not aligning the way they were supposed to. And across the city, Lily sat beside the bed once more, her fingers gently adjusting the thin blanket as the man's breathing steadied just enough to give her a fragile sense of hope. And the nurse returned with a clipboard, her expression more serious now. We need confirmation for the next procedure, she said softly. The payment you provided covered the emergency intervention, but what comes next will require more. Lily nodded slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the small silver key on the table, her thumb brushing over its worn edges as if drawing strength from it, because that key was no longer just metal. It was proof of what she had risked, what she had chosen, and what she might still have to lose. And back in the tower of glass and certainty, Ethan Caldwell looked once more at the frozen image on the screen, and for the first time, the question was no longer what she did, but why she did it. And that question refused to stay quiet. The question lingered long after the room had gone quiet, settling into Ethan Caldwell's thoughts like a splinter he could not ignore. And for the first time in years, certainty did not come easily to him, because every answer he reached seemed to open another gap, another inconsistency that refused to fit into the clean, structured world he had built. And he turned back to Claire, his voice controlled but no longer dismissive. Trace the transfer again. Every step, every account, I want to know exactly where that money went. And Claire nodded, already anticipating the shift, her fingers moving quickly across the tablet as she pulled up deeper layers of the transaction history, the kind that required clearance beyond standard review. And as the data loaded, the room filled with the quiet hum of processing systems and restrained anticipation, until finally a series of linked transfers appeared on the screen, fragmented at first, routed through intermediary accounts designed to obscure origin, but not completely, not to someone looking closely enough. And Claire leaned forward, her voice lower now, more focused. This was not random. This was structured, intentional. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the sequence, his mind mapping patterns, timing, access points. And then he saw it, a final destination account tied knot.